Hello and welcome back to the Disruptive Innovation Festival, the online festival of ideas that asks the question, what if we could redesign everything? My name is Joe and I'll be your host for today's very special headline act, and we're thrilled to have Dr. John Maeda joining us today. John is the head of Computational Design and Inclusion at Automattic. They're the folks behind WordPress, which is a little something you may have heard of. And he was previously head of Rhode Island School of Design. You may also know him for his multiple TED Talks and his books, Laws of Simplicity and Redesigning Leadership, among others. And it's that range of experience, from advice perhaps to designing beautiful, simple objects, to figuring out how design can actually increase inclusivity, that's highly appropriate for our DIF theme this year, Future of Design. So I want to spend some time today speaking with John about the power of design. What can design really do? And when we're talking about design, what's our level of ambition? What is the change that design can really bring about? But first, John, thank you so much for joining us here at the Disruptive Innovation Festival.
Hello.
Now, people might know you from one of those TED Talks that I mentioned, as they are in the millions of views. Or from your books, which I also spoke a little bit about. But can you just tell us briefly, to get us going, what you're doing now at a company like Automattic?
Well, I think like 4 years ago, I left the ivory tower world and went to Silicon Valley to work in venture capital with startups. And it was transformative. I could see how the technology industry needed to consider design as not a special power, but a partner in all the other types of things that a startup has to do well. And after that experience, I realized that I wanted to work in a startup. So by joining Automattic, I'm at a late stage startup and having the time of my life, and I'm super busy. So the Slack pings are hitting me and I have to go back, but I'm glad to be here.
Good. Well, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. And for those watching online, do remember to add your comments, get the discussion going below the video that you're watching now, or on Twitter, use @ThinkDiff_ or #ThinkDiff. John, I want to kick off with a few, let's call them design basics, so that we're all speaking the same language when we're talking about design. So let's think of these as our little starter or our hors d'oeuvre in the topic of design. So, John, what is your definition of design?
Well, I've been at this sort of borderline between art and science for a while, like design and engineering for a while, since the 80s, actually. So each year, my definition of design has evolved, but now I have a pretty simple definition, which depends upon your context. The design and tech reports are things I launched at South by Southwest with a little team at Kleiner Perkins. And each year, we're now in the 4th year, we work to define design in the framing of the tech industry. And there's basically 3 kinds of design competing for attention. And that's kind of the problem. You have one kind of design I call classical design. Classical design is that old school style of design, designing with your hands and your mind, and Johnny Ive, insert Bauhaus, male authority of design goodness. It really dominates the education field. And then there is design thinking, which is something that has captured the attention of large corporations. It's more of a management consulting technique to unlock innovation in a stuck organization, to reconnect with the consumer, because the larger the company gets, the further away it gets from real customers. And the third kind is computational design, which is design that I was fortunate to be early involved with when I was at MIT at the Media Lab, bringing together people who were good at engineering and good at design and just making stuff that no one really understood, but now is very commonplace. Things that change on the screen, things that fly around, things that morph, things that adapt. This is a new kind of design that uses computational media. It doesn't, this here uses sort of paper, rock, concrete, metal. This here uses the fabric of people, organizations, and this uses the fabric of anything involving computing, sensing, the new things that have emerged on our world stage and are disrupting everything.
And is it a case, I mean, this segmentation is fascinating. Is it a case that one replaces the other? You see every year design changing. Do the older versions, does classical design become less relevant?
No, they're all existing right now concurrently. They're all. The problem when you say design is it gets very confusing to people. It's because these three definitions are still here. One isn't replacing the other. It's just they're all different flavors of design. I like to say that the word design is poorly designed because it's so darn confusing. That's it. It's like duct tape. Do you know duct tape? I'm not sure in Europe if you have duct tape.
No, we have duct tape.
But duct tape goes everywhere. So design goes everywhere because it's so many things. This kind of design produced a lot of value during the Industrial Revolution. Things were being made, manufactured. This kind of design has come into the foreground in our post-manufacturing world, where we're much more services oriented. We're asking questions about the people involved in the delivery of people-based services. This kind of design is brand new because it's post-industrial, it's post-services, it's basically highly automated type of things. And so you could argue that this will dominate in the end. This will essentially destroy, quote unquote, all these other types of design. But no, I think we humans will resist that change. So there's always going to be people who believe in classical design. There are always people who will need organizations, belongingness. They'll need design thinking. But computational design will continue to move at a rate that we all are having difficulty comprehending because it's powered by Moore's law thinking. Moore's law being the doubling of transistors every year to year and a half. So things are getting twice as good every year to year and a half, which is not normal.
And you mentioned about the kind of the human part of this and the role of individuals. You've been involved in teaching design, and admittedly a confusing term, as you pointed out, at schools and universities. Some might say we're all designers. In fact, we've had speakers at the DIF before that say if design is the first signal of human intention, and as soon as you change the world to meet your needs, you're involved in the design process. And design tools seem to be becoming more accessible. Is design something that we can all play a role in? I mean, computational design sounds pretty hard compared with classical design, where maybe anyone could start sketching something out and having a go.
Well, I'm not really involved in teaching design. I think that's like a misnomer in a way. I think I stopped teaching these kind of things in the 90s after I realized I had nothing to teach. Because I was like, whoa, wait a second. The world's changing so fast. I have to get into the real world. So I've like left that type of thinking that I have anything to convey. I'm in a learning. I've been learning for the last 10 or so years about what civilization is and how creativity and the possibility of making, whether it's making things the old way, making things with organizations, or making things with computation. What I have to come to conclusion around is that this kind of design is holding us back because it doesn't involve computation so much, but consumers are discovering it. Like you described yourself, like maybe Joe, you're not a photographer, but you've got this like thing in your pocket or your bag or whatever, and it's like, that's a good photograph, Joe. And they're like, hey, I'm a photographer. Or like, you're sitting there and you like, press a few buttons and suddenly you've got like a banner, like a web banner or whatever. It's like, whoa, I just made an ad. And so what's happening is that a lot of classical design skill is being emulated by computation, therefore putting in the hands of consumers. And what you'll see is people who are classical designers will say, Joe, you're not a photographer. You're not a designer. Go home. Because that's the way this world operates. It's a little bit snobby. But in reality, Joe, you're like, hey, this is a good photograph. This is a good ad. I would say feel comfortable knowing that you're leveraging what's happening here. For those people who choose to stay here, I'm totally okay with that. But I caution anyone stuck here, because this world is stuck in a world where it believes that men create everything. I'll give an example. You ask any person who loves classical design, name your top 10 favorite designers. They're all going to name generally men. It's because that's the whole doctrine. It's been taught the old way. But Joe, you're like a modern person. You've got your beard, your stylish beard. You know that half the world is women. So how is it possible for an entire field to leave out half the other world? And how can it be actually an amazing field?
And this picks up on your current role around inclusion, which we're going to delve into a bit more in a few minutes. But I just final question on design. And you mentioned about design and engineering, and part of your roles over the years have looked at the intersection there. And I was reading an interview that in which you were the interviewer recently about a new product you developed at Automattic. And you were talking about how an engineer thinks versus how a designer thinks. How have you found the techniques or the practices to enable them to work together?
Oh, well, I didn't. Well, the new thing you're describing is a new feature we launched to enable payments on a WordPress.com site. And that just came from an observation of working with small business owners in Detroit and Philadelphia. I've been in different parts of the United States that are socioeconomically deprived of resources, and learning more about what's this web stuff good for. And each time I work with someone who like is on the other side of the digital divide, I'm like, whoa, you really need this. Then I've got to make this better. And someone said to me, it's so good you're helping those poor people. And I said, no, they're helping me realize how stupid I am, because I can't imagine why someone needs this. And so my role in that has neither been a designer or engineer. I'm more of a PM, a product manager type thinker. And I'm helping to connect the designers, the business thinkers, the engineers to discover that if you make something for people, you are designing a productive product, which may sound ridiculous when you think about it, like, well, why aren't people making things that are good for real people? It's a very simple reason. It's because engineering, you're taught to make something, make it so it doesn't like break down. For design, you're taught to make it like really feel really well, feel good, based upon some like timeless principles from the past. Okay? Now what you end up is making something that doesn't fail, that feels good for certain someones who are from this world over here. And so you make it this amazing product that serves no real market need. So what I've been doing is showing that there's a market, exposing people to what their needs are, working with them to create the product, bringing in engineering, which I respect, like as I originally trained as an engineer, and connect the dots. So I'm, this phase of my life, I'm a big PM fan.
And let's just talk about a previous phase of your life, which I know is, as you say, you mentioned at the start, is the ivory tower days, the laws of simplicity days.
Yeah, that was were like really good days. happy days in the Shire in Lord of the Rings terminology. Smoking my pipe with whatever was inside there, and just kind of like having my ale, my Hobbit ale
it
or
sounds
whatever.
idyllic. It sounds beautiful.
It was wonderful. I would fish every day. Fish.
So, admitting that that is in the past, 10 years on from Laws of Simplicity, are they still relevant? Is there a reason that you've left them in the Shire? Or what would you change about them now?
Oh, well, a lot of how I thought is still valid, I think, because I was thinking in terms of this, classical, and I was thinking in terms of computation, because I understood where computation was heading. So I wouldn't say like all of the thoughts in that are useful, but I think most of them are. Like once in a while I'll go back and like read the book and like, whoa, did I really say that? Did I write that? Oh, that's kind of useful. Or like, I don't know if I would say it this way anymore. But in my later years, I began focusing on leadership because, maybe you figured something out, but how do you lead it to action is actually much harder. How do you move an organization towards something? That's why running a college was a very helpful lesson for me, because I learned how to lead at scale. It's kind of like, Joe, you can like talk to anyone in the world this way, but if you don't have a team of people working with you, figuring out the audio and the video, whatever, you're going to look just like some YouTube kid in the basement. But your team is making you look awesome.
Thank you.
And that's the difference between someone who can just make things versus someone who can actually lead it into existence. But a leader isn't very good unless they understand making, because then they have no empathy for those who they work with. That's why I still stay active. I still write JavaScript. I still edit web pages. I still do everything myself, because I believe that's a way to stay, I guess, a more hands-on leader. Even though when you get older, you tend to become more hands-off. I've resisted that desire to go back to the Shire because I went to the Shire too young. So I'm kind of like running around, Shireless. It's pretty good.
And when you start talking about teams of people or running a college, and it seems that those sorts of systems might be more complex, and I guess in putting forward the case for simplicity, you were in some ways choosing simplicity over complexity, but it seems like some of the problems that we face as a society and as an economy now are incredibly complex. Do we now need to embrace complexity to try and tackle them?
Oh, Joe, that's why you're Joe. I see it now. Okay. Yeah. Well, the thing about the laws of simplicity is I framed it as you don't know simplicity unless you know complexity, right? It's kind of like if you had vanilla ice cream all your life, you would never know it's vanilla unless you had chocolate. So I think simplicity as an idea is important to keep in mind, in context, in frame with complexity. And the problem with complexity, because of computation, is maybe simplicity doesn't change a lot, but because of Moore's law, it's just moving so fast that it just moved off the screen. It like shot up through this building, etc. So that complexity, if you ignore, you are ignoring at your own peril. So I think as I came out of the ivory tower and that kind of organizational world and went to Silicon Valley, I was able to see rockets flying all over the place. And I began thinking, wow, I saw the world this small. Now I see it this big. And I can say that complexity is not stopping. That said, if you sit there and eat complexity popcorn all day long and watch the movie, I mean, the first thing you're going to wake up and tweet is like machine intelligence is coming, blah, 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 the robots are coming, because you live in that, it's the complexity of it. So I think I was lucky to have been in that I'm lucky to sort of like straddle both the power of complexity and the joys of simplicity, and find meaningful ways to connect them through people, through organizations. And that's why I wanted to join a late stage startup running at scale to see if I could pull them together organizationally, these kinds of ideas.
And is that how you would advise designers out there who are trying to navigate this kind of complex, changing, evolving world? Would you advise them to get out there and experience a load of different things in the same way you have?
Oh my gosh. Well, you reminded me, like, I was very lucky to have some amazing teachers. And you just reminded me how I had this typography professor, this Professor Nishikawa. And, when you're like in your 20s, you're looking for Yoda. Yoda's going to look kind of old usually, right? And like, I was like looking for Yoda, and like, there was Yoda. It's Professor Nishikawa. He was like Yoda. It was like probably in his late 60s. When you're younger, you think everyone's super old, but he was like in his 60s, maybe early 60s. And I just really admired him. He was like crusty and, the old fashioned way, how Chihold will do it, or like, or Herbert Bayer books, all over your bathroom, and just kind of like, Bauhaus embodied, and I really admired him. And he was a total like old school typographer. And one time I was like having a lunch with him, and he said to me, what do you want to do with your life? And I said, I want to be just like you. I want to be a classical typographer. I want to like cut type the old way. I want to sit there where, figure it out, like, how 0.001 points is different than 0.002. I want to sit there and stare at the rag. I want to like look at it with and I'll never forget how angry he was at me. He was just so angry. I thought he'd be like excited. Like Yoda's like, oh good, you want to like, follow me in this like old way. He said, no, he said, you're so young. So you should do something young with yourself. Because don't forget, the classics will still be there when you're older. It's your job to embrace what's new. And it was like a big light bulb. And I realized, wow, well, I went to MIT. I know computer science. Art school was idyllic and lovely and odd and strange. And I was embarrassed to say I was a computer science person. But then I said, no, maybe I'll embrace this diversity that I represent. And I went out and bought a Next computer. Steve Jobs had just announced a Next computer running display PostScript. I pulled it out and started running software. And it was amazing, because the problem with being an engineer is you can build anything, but you don't know what to build. But because I was in art school for so long, I realized I knew exactly what I wanted to make. So whatever program I wrote, it wasn't like aimless writing software. It was like, I need this program to do this. And that unlocked a lot for me. So what I'm saying is that if you're younger and you think you want to live in this classical bubble and like set type and, carve things out of wood and whatever, you better hope you have a trust fund where you can like, do that. But if you aren't, you're going to fail. Most likely, like 99%. Yes, maybe the 0.1% is going to like make it, be discovered, etc. But that's some kind of strange Hollywood thing. If you stay in here when you're young, you're not going to realize that this thing is moving at light speed. So come out here, embrace this. Don't be afraid of it, because if you're afraid of it, then you're just going to lose out in all the possibility. I can just imagine in my 20s, if I stayed in that world, I probably would have been really happy, but I would have been irrelevant every year. Happily irrelevant, maybe.
And you talk about the embracing this change, embracing technological change, and it seems that at the moment there are many people out there, many people watching, who might be a bit nervous or apprehensive about some of the change that we're seeing on the horizon with things like technological unemployment. Society seems to be changed through things like self-driving cars and so on. Where do you stand on that? We just got a note of optimism, but is it unbridled optimism?
Optimism? Oh, I wouldn't say I'm optimistic. I will say that I'm a pragmatic optimist. So I will temper it with, like, I don't think everything is going to be rosy. Well, this notion that, we hear about, AI, or we hear about flying cars, or we hear about, one thing you notice is once you start looking at, let's use analogy. So like, Joe, you like to eat, maybe? I like to eat. Some people don't like to eat anything. You like to eat, right? So there's that moment where you start asking yourself, like, what am I eating? Where is it coming from? And you realize that if it's coming from the same place, it's going to be the same, right? Like, let's say you like tapas or something, right? You eat tapas every day, it gets kind of boring, right? The first time is pretty awesome. And after a while, it's like, I'm delicious tapas again. Okay. And so you realize, like, maybe I should, like, change it up, right? And we're like, hey, let's try some, like, Indian food or Malaysian food or any kind of food, right? You start imagining what happens if you have different food. But, Joe, if you ate, like, like super hot curry every day, all you know is, like, hot stuff. Like, oh my gosh, this food's pretty hot. This food is so hot. And so I think in people who follow technology, you got to look at where it's coming from. And you'll notice one simple fabric, one common strand. And again, this is something that a friend taught me. She's an engineering leader. She was saying, look at everything you're doing and ask yourself if half the people you're talking with are women or not. And this is a really simple thing because it's just biologically, it's not a social justice thing. It's like rationally. If you're respecting everyone's opinion and you want to hear their opinion, if you're not hearing half of the opinions coming from women, then you're kind of like only hearing half of the world. And you can apply that to every possible, like, well, if I'm only listening to people who are British, I'm limiting myself. If I'm only limiting people from Africa, I'm limiting myself. So how diverse a set of sources are you getting? So I would ask anyone who's saying, oh my gosh, did you read Elon Musk, blah, blah, blah. Elon Musk, or whoever. Insert the 10 other pundits who tend to be Caucasian males. And you think to yourself, like, why am I taking everything from them? What are other people saying? And yes, of course, there are women who will talk about AI taking over the world. I'm not saying it's limited to men versus women. But, like, well, what does a person from, like, a socioeconomically declining area talk about? The last thing they're talking about is AI. They're not talking about it.
Isn't that a problem? Because aren't they, if they're not talking about it, there's maybe a sense of powerlessness that AI will happen to them and it'll change their life.
So good, Joe. So there's that phrase you said just now. Isn't that a problem? So whose problem is it? And the question is, do you feel accountable to solve that problem or not? Right? So I feel like a professional pundit can point out the problem, but doesn't have empathy for solving the problem or accountability around it. I spent most of my life in the ivory tower where we could talk about these problems. Oh my gosh, it's a problem. Oh my gosh, it's a problem. But in the end, you're not accountable to solve the problem. So I would frame it as, I've just discovered that what I hear is not from diversified sources. I've broadened those sources. I've gone face to face with these sources, and I'm working to solve their problems because I think the problems are solvable with my engineering skills and my design skills and my business hat on, and my PM thinking. And I'm just going after them one by one. I'm a bit Don Quixote-esque in this phase right now where I know it's impossible. But, for example, when I was in West Virginia a couple of weeks ago, going into towns that have lost their main source of income, coal mining. And these are what are called conservative towns. You know, I'm sure, like, let's see, in the UK, there was a big referendum where it was suddenly people discovered that there were people who didn't care about what coastal urban elites care about.
Yeah.
You know, how could they not care about what we care about? You know, that's a problem. But I realized my problem was I didn't understand their problems well enough. And yes, indeed, you know, the coal mining industry has impacted certain parts of the United States. And, you know, they need jobs. And those jobs are being taken away by different energy industries, but also because of Elon Musk, machine intelligence. It's coming, you know, machine intelligence is coming. And they see, in some of these regions, I saw that they saw their salvation as making websites as a way to generate income remotely in the Appalachian Mountain regions that are very remote. Like, they could be able to build websites for companies. But meanwhile, my machine intelligence hat is saying, but in 3 years from now, nobody will be building websites because Facebook will have taken over the world in some form, or Google will have done it together, right? So I can see this coming. And when I work with these populations, my goal is to extend the lifetime of people who can make things and make a living. I don't believe it's possible to extend it forever, but I want to extend it for as long as possible.
And what does extending that bring? Why is that important?
It's important because this world here, where the machine intelligence has taken everything over, and the audience is actually not real people, they're just robots listening to the stream, and Joe is an avatar that's in machine generated.
Oh gosh.
Where his voice has been synthesized.
You're making me nervous now, John.
You know, and the background is actually some kind of beautiful dacha somewhere in Russia, where it's been synthesized and adapted to every audience member, where I'm not really alive anymore. You know, maybe I died 5 years ago and I'm like machine generated from all my like different talks. So that's going to occur because it's possible to build it. So, but it's impossible for the average person to affect how that's built. That's why open source software, to me, is a kind of a light bulb, because open source software, quite frankly, is kind of crappy. Right? Like, oh my gosh, I like this other thing. It's so shiny. The mobile app is so amazing. You know, why would I use this open source stuff? Well, this shiny thing, you can't affect how it's produced. You can't control the algorithms. But this unshiny thing of open source is all fungible, touchable. It's the car that you can still open the hood and move pieces around and understand how it works. So I like open source because it means that for a time before machine intelligence consumes the world, more human beings will understand how this technology works.
So open source, I'm getting you see the benefits from a learning point of view, and from off the back of that, people are more able to participate in the development of all the apps and tools and services we'll use in the future. How would you convince today's perhaps skeptical business audience of the benefits of an open source approach? Because we seem to be in a kind of, I mean, you mentioned some of the big digital players today, but it seems quite closed, quite locked down, not perhaps that we could open the hood and have a play ourselves with some of the things that we use in our daily lives.
Wow. Well, it was when I was at a World Economic Forum event, and that's where I met Ellen, your leader, the leader of this. And she was talking about the circular economy, all the work she's done to lobby world leaders around this kind of thinking, and industry leaders as well. It made me think that some people might be open to different types of thinking, not everyone. So when I'm talking about open source today, do I believe it's going to succeed? Do I believe the circular economy will run 100% of the world? Absolutely not. Maybe it'll run 5 to 10% of the world. Good. So for me on the open source side, I'm not imagining a world where everyone gets it or buys into it. I can see a need for it. And I can see a need for it in these parts of the world that have been left on the other side of the digital divide as just consumers. So for those populations, I like the idea that they have tools that they can control and learn from while this thing, machine intelligence, is moving like off the charts. I don't know how many people will be able to participate in this kind of thinking, open source thinking, but that's what I'm after right now.
To the people watching online, don't forget to keep the discussion going about this session, about this conversation with John Maeda in the discussion forum below or on Twitter using hashtag ThinkDiff. We'd love to hear your views and opinions on this session. John, one thing I just wanted to pick up on, I was browsing, doing my homework for this session. I visited your Twitter page and I noticed that you've had a tweet pinned on there since 2015 saying that you've been carrying around little shards of notes with the goal of creating the laws of design for business. Is that still happening, or is that are you teasing us?
No, I'm not teasing it. I was supposed to finish a book last year, but I've been kind of busy. That's why I gotta leave this and start doing I gotta finish my main work and then finish that book. But I have an archetype of a book that explains these things, that updates my thinking around simplicity in the context of leadership, especially in this Silicon Valley frame. But I haven't been able to finish it.
Okay, well.
That's my embarrassing thing that I put there, pinned to embarrass myself into completing.
Shame yourself into finishing it.
You reminded me of my failure, and it is something that I put out there because I like to fail less. So that's why.
Well, in that case, I'm very glad I reminded you. We've got just about 10 minutes left in this session, so I want to bring it back to this theme, future of design, with our last few questions here. And firstly, we've touched upon some of the potential, but in your view, what is the role of the designer in a prosperous and effective society that works in the long term?
The role of the designer is to understand the customer by working directly with them and working with them at the scale of millions using data. I think those three things is the role of the designer: to gather qualitative information and gather quantitative information, and especially now leverage computation to make things that previously were impossible to make in service of those people that they're working with.
And that's something you're seeing with Automattic in the day-to-day with this head of inclusion role, that design can achieve that sort of thing.
Well, it's a philosophy that I've been developing with all of the designers and product people and developers. We've been blogging about it too. It's at ahcdesignflow.wordpress.com. We're just talking out loud about this, and I'm the PM. I'm collecting all the parts, sort of forming them into things. Execute. That's my goal.
And so we touched earlier about how designers can kind of stay ready for this complex world that's evolving all the time. What do you think will be the single biggest disruption affecting how design occurs in the next 10 to 20 years? Is it down to this computational design?
Oh, it's definitely computational design. It's, the more that these cloud-based services learn about us, the less relevant we become for anything involving patterns. Because the machine intelligence algorithms are just so amazing at learning patterns and then repeating patterns back to us. And we don't know it. Like some of the photographs coming back that are computer generated, some of the text being produced, the new Siri. Have you heard how like Siri's voices evolved from like robotic to like, is that a real person?
Mm-hmm.
You know, so some of the stuff that machine intelligence can write, the writing that can be produced, some of the videos that are auto-generated by these algorithms. So this is a real thing. Most creative production will be able to be generated by these algorithms. There'll be a huge question about what is good and what is not good, but the reality is to understand how it works, what its limitations are, and can you still remain relevant in that new world.
And this is a good note for us to almost end on, but what would be your advice, your tip for someone listening or watching online for how to stay relevant? If they were going to go and read or view one thing now, what would you recommend they do?
Oh, well, I would tell them to read anything. I would tell them to do something. So if you're in the classical design camp hiding in the Shire, you have to leave there if you're young and you don't have a trust fund. Okay? I would say the design thinking one is an interesting place to be, but you're not making a lot of things. So I would say enter the computational design space, get involved with things like processing, which is a system that two people on my team created a long time ago, Ben Fry and Casey Rees. It's still out there. Get involved with the WordPress community or Drupal. The thing I love about open source is that open source is like, everything is okay to switch. So anything involving open source on the content side, get involved with, help to improve the tools and systems. That's what I would recommend you do. Do more making, do less hiding in the Shire, do less management consulting. Come into this space over here.
Well, you heard it, folks. Do less hiding in the Shire, do more making. John, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today at the Disruptive Innovation Festival.
Honored to be here, and I love Ellen. What an amazing leader. Okay.
We're very lucky. Thank you very much. And to all of you watching online, that's all we've got time for at this DIF 2017 Headline Act. Thank you for joining us. And don't forget, there are many more sessions on the schedule, both about the future of design, but our other themes, 21st century economics and the age of automation, massive topics that I could have spent ages talking to John about today. But that's all for this session. Keep the discussion going in the comments below or on Twitter, #ThinkDiff, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.